Now, we were supposed to have Mr. Peter Hall, our General Manager for the Townsville Correctional Complex, to deliver today's presentation. But not unfortunately, he's actually in the Cook Islands now. Bless you. He's actually in the Cook Islands now, celebrating his 25th wedding anniversary. So he took the kids. I think he took the wife as well, and so he took everybody, and he sends his apologies. He originally wanted to do this via lecture podcast, sort of vodcast sort of thingy, but unfortunately he had to leave fairly early. So he would have loved to be here, but instead you have me. So what has happened is that I co-authored this paper of his, and what I'll do is speak on his behalf, if you'll allow me to do so. Now, as I said, Mr. Peter is the General Manager for the Townsville Correctional Complex, and when he wrote this paper, he wanted to show how far his institution or his prison went towards moving away from simply using prisons as a tool of deterrence. So he wanted to show all of us that quite uniquely within the Queensland region, as well as certain parts of Australia, that our prison system is actually, in a sense, moving towards a more humane, more decent environment that privileges rehabilitation over deterrence and retribution and denunciation and even incapacitation. So that was the crux of his narrative. So I'll begin from there. It has been argued that making a real difference in a problematic situation requires the delivery of solutions that are designed specifically to meet local needs. And that's really important, ensuring that our solutions take into account our specific local needs as opposed to using a general template. And through that approach, improved outcomes can be more readily achieved. So this paper will therefore attempt to show how the Townsville Correctional Complex has designed and or delivered a range of offender interventions, in particular those that are motivational in nature, that have not only rigorously taken into account the particular prisoner cohort characteristics, strengths and deficits, but to also actively leverage on regional stakeholder strengths and resources. Baby agrees. So as to improve the prospect of recidivism reduction post-release. Now, how Townsville, through such local initiatives, contributes to improving criminal justice policies more generally for North Queensland will likewise be traversed. And where relevant, partner organizations involved in the delivery of these programs or services will be included in this analysis. Thereafter, certain upcoming measures will be highlighted in order to provide us with some indication or signposts in terms of what the future will hold for us, at least from a penological development perspective in this region. Now, it is important to acknowledge that the dominant aim or use of prisons appears to have changed. Okay, it appears to have changed over time, and according to certain political quarters, prisons in this postmodern age are no longer places of punishment. Now, when we talk about punishment in this particular context, we're referring to prisons being used primarily for the purposes of deterrence and or retribution. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are those the only aims that a prison sentence is supposed to achieve? According to Section 9, okay, according to Section 9 of the Penalties and Sentences Act 1992, Queensland, the only purposes for which sentences may be imposed on an offender are retribution. Now, retribution is sometimes called just desserts, rehabilitation, deterrence, and I'm sure a lot of you will know that even deterrence can be broken up into at least two different categories. There's specific deterrence and general deterrence, and denunciation, as well as incapacitation or community safety. So these are the legislative aims. So whatever sentence the courts mete out, at least one or more of these objectives must be met. Now, in theory and practice, the imposition of a prison sentence can indeed achieve any one or more of these aforesaid aims, right? So, however, as I highlighted earlier, the dominant aim or use of prisons by the state as a form of retribution, deterrence, or rehabilitation has, over time and space, changed considerably. And this change in its primary purpose is also mirrored in changes in the physical environment and the type of social climate that we see engendered in these prisons. So there seems to be like a correlation, or at least a step. They both walk step by step together. Now, what do I mean by that? For example, prisons in many Western liberal democracies have, either through necessity or circumstance, become less austere, less authoritative, and less punitive establishments, adopting instead a more humane and decent type of environment. Now, this arguably reflects a change in the primary way in which the state employs prisons as a tool when addressing the criminality of its citizens. Thus, where prisons are principally used as a tool of deterrence, you will notice that, generally speaking, the prisons will therefore look more austere, more punitive, and more authoritative. In contrast, when the state preferences rehabilitation or therapeutic ideals, then invariably, prisons also become more humane, okay? Both in terms of the physical structures and amenities, as well as the type of social climate that exists or that is engendered by senior management. Having said that, however, a linear historical progression from harsh to humane prisons should not be assumed. And as seen in many comparative penological studies, alternating harsh, humane approaches have actually been seen in many countries throughout history. So, for example, if you look at England's horrific prisons and jails in the 18th century, right? Now, they experienced considerable reform through the efforts of, among others, the great penal reformer and humanitarian John Howard, that ultimately led to the passing of the Penitentiary Act of 1779. And yet, appalling conditions returned once again, especially during the tenure of Sir Edmund Duquesne, who became the chairman of the Board of Directors of convict prisons in England and Wales during the 19th century. Now, this proverbial swinging of the pendulum can be seen and would be seen time and time again across a range of Western liberal democracies. Now, who can forget the heyday of rehabilitative zeal within prisons and community corrections during the 1960s and 1970s? So obviously my students here were not born then, so you will not remember this. But for a lot of us, that was the heyday whenever we think about prisons. Prisons, community corrections, they were premised on the objective of rehabilitating or treating the offender. And yet, we see something like this being replaced by the rallying cry of nothing works. Okay? Nothing works, heralding the therapeutic nihilism that resulted in the proliferation of incarcerative institutions built primarily not to treat, not to rehabilitate, but rather to incapacitate and warehouse so as to protect the community from these apparently irredeemable or unteachable offenders. Now, this issue, of course, is extremely complex, and a comprehensive analysis of it cannot be done here today. However, we should still bear this in mind. Okay? These types of issues still should be borne in mind, particularly when members of the public call for prisons to be more effective tools of deterrence through the imposition of harsher penalties. We see this quite regularly whenever we log on to Facebook, when we read newspapers, when we watch the news and things like that. People are calling for harsher penalties, and the harshest penalty that Australia has within its arsenal is the prison. Now, while such a move will certainly satisfy the aims of denunciation and perhaps even retribution and just desserts, so long as these punishments are proportional to the seriousness of the crimes committed, it should be noted, however, that there exists a corpus of evidence contrary to the position that harsher, higher security prisons are more effective in reducing recidivism because of its deterrent quality. Now, relying upon studies conducted by Ritchie 2011 and Saar 2011, White and Perrone argued that prisons do not work if its primary aim is to deter incarcerated offenders from reoffending. According to them, it doesn't work. To that end, they actually likened prisons, when used as a tool of deterrence, to that of a conveyor belt or a revolving door. Now, if therefore it is argued that less punitive prison environments correspondingly reduces the deterrent quality of the punishment, then the expected outcome of that should, at least in theory, be an increase in recidivism. But is this assertion empirically supported? Now, if you look at the relevant data from some of the prisons in Norway, in particular Halden and Bastøy, you will notice that their statistics actually show quite a different story, quite different outcomes. Now, here, the recidivism rate typically hovers around the 16 to 20% range or mark, making Norway a country which has one of the lowest reoffending rates in the world. Now, in contrast, during a similar period, 2014 to 2015, 44.8% of prisoners who were released from Australian prisons were sadly re-incarcerated within just 2 years. 16 to 20, 44.8. Now, Dedi explained that the Norwegian penological approach eschews the traditional sort of repressive prison model in favor of one that treats inmates in a humane way, because according to their policymakers, this increases the likelihood of reintegrative outcomes being successful post-release. Now, these attempts to achieve such positive reintegrative outcomes are further scaffolded, and this is really important, are further scaffolded once they leave the prison, are further scaffolded by the provision within the community of safety net provisions or safety net services, including, for example, housing, employment, education, as well as health, and, if necessary, drug rehabilitation. So everything, in a sense, is taken care of once that person is released. Now, in fact, the physical environment and the engendered social climate of these Norwegian prisons, these are guided by this thing called the principle of normality, which, according to Dedi, means that with the exception of the issue of freedom of movement, prisoners retain all other rights, and life in the prison should, according to this approach, resemble life on the outside to the greatest extent possible. In fact, one of the architects of the prison in Halden, a maximum security prison in Norway, explained how, in order to create this sense of family, okay, this sense of family. Now, this sense of family is not just between the inmates themselves, but also between the prisoners and the prison officers. This sense of family, but particularly between the inmates, where the provision of flat-screen televisions and mini-fridges, long windows to let in more sunlight, and shared living rooms and kitchens were included or built into the design of that prison. Now, mind you, this is a maximum security prison over there, right? These were built into this type of incarcerative institution. Now, Jukes explained that prison architecture, the way it's physically designed, is actually inscribed with meaning. It's not just bricks and mortar. The bricks and mortar mean something to us. So, one can infer from a prison's facade and internal organization what the particular philosophical stance on punishment was at the time it was commissioned, designed, or constructed. Now, Jukes actually gives a very interesting example where she says something along these lines, that if you put somebody in a very, very repressive cell with bars and everything is really fenced up, that communicates the idea or meaning that that person is an animal. And as a result, at least according to these scholars, as a result, that person will slowly but surely believe and accept that designation that he or she is an animal. So when you think about the issue of rehabilitation in those types of circumstances, the chances are less likely that you will then have a person who is going to be amenable to being rehabilitated. Now, more importantly, such prison design, whether benign or beastly, can potentially impact upon the attitudes and subsequent behaviors of both the correctional staff as well as the inmates. For example, Jukes argued that hard architecture, so hard architecture is defined here or is given illustrations of bars on windows, concrete walls, hard surface floors, drab colors, indestructible and uncomfortable furniture. So hard architecture not only destroys the prisoner's self-esteem and influences the ways in which the staff think of and behave towards the people in their custody and care, but also, as I said earlier, determines the type of identity and behavior that flows from that person. Now, while the physical environment certainly appears to be important within this type of Norwegian model, it should be noted that these prisons are also very, very much involved in creating a positive social climate for their correctional staff and inmates, as evidenced by the architect of Halden actually saying that he wanted to create a sense of family, a tangible sense of family within the prison. Now, it is important to note that the type of social climate or institutional environment engendered by these senior managers can significantly impact upon the attitudes and behaviors of staff and inmates alike. Now, what do we mean by social climate or institutional climate? Now, this basically refers to a relatively enduring quality of an organization's internal environment, distinguishing it from other environments or distinguishing it from other organizations, which A, results from the behavior and policies of members of the organization, especially management, obviously, because they have the authority and power to make these types of changes. B, which is perceived by members of the organization. C, which serves as a basis for interpreting the situation. And finally, D, it acts as a source of pressure for directing the activity and obviously the behavior. Now, to that end, Griffin discovered that the social climate variables like perceived authority to exercise control over the inmates, the fear of victimization by the inmates, as well as the quality of supervision between the correctional officer and his or her boss or supervisor, had a great deal of influence over the correctional officer's readiness to use force against the inmates. And that's really interesting. So, depending on your social environment or social climate within your prisons, that can be a very, very strong guiding force in terms of whether the correctional officer will then be repressive or will be understanding and so on and so forth. Now, furthermore, Day, Casey, Vest, and Huisi found that the more positive the social climate, particularly in relation to factors like 1, the inmates' social cohesion and mutual support, 2, the holding and supporting of each other in terms of the staff taking a personal interest in the development of these inmates, and 3, this experience safety, whether there were any aggressive people within their unit. Now, the more positive the social environment, the social climate, the more ready these inmates wanted to engage in offender rehabilitative programs. Now, the implication here is quite important because that will mean that when we think about responsivity, when we think about the capacity of our inmate or client in terms of successfully going through our rehabilitative program, becomes quite stark when we think about its impact in relation to the social climate of our institution, whether it's a prison, whether it's within the community. In fact, it was similarly discovered that a more positive social environment was also associated with higher levels of staff morale and lower levels of stress in the working environment. Now, it is therefore arguable that this will naturally also improve the quality of treatment or service delivery because your officers are going to be happier and they probably won't be taking their frustrations out on the prisoners. Now, let me please make this clear. This paper is not suggesting that the Norwegian model should be adopted, whether in part or in whole, particularly when it may potentially compromise the need for secure containment. So this paper is not saying that at all. What it is, however, saying is that it does, looking at the Norwegian model, it does certainly raise the question as to why should successful reintegration be such a dominant aim of the penological enterprise? Why should successful reintegration be the dominant aim of the penological enterprise? Now, I think the answer actually boils down to this. If you read Rule 4 of the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners, it's also called the Nelson Mandela Rules. Now, it actually says this: the purposes of sentence of imprisonment or similar measures deprivative of a person's liberty are primarily to protect society against crime and to reduce recidivism. Now, and this is the kicker, those purposes can only be achieved if the period of imprisonment is used to ensure, as far as possible, the reintegration of such persons into society upon release so that they can lead a law-abiding and self-supporting life. So, do you remember when I outlined the 5 main aims of punishment? You can see that the way this Rule 4 is structured, it actually privileges or preferences one particular aim. So, what does Rule 4 really mean? How should time be spent in prison so as to maximize the likelihood of reintegration? Now, I went through this really interesting report done by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And they analyzed Rule 4. And they said that in its basic principles, these Nelson Mandela rules very clearly establish the provision of rehabilitative programs in prisons, which fosters the willingness and ability of prisoners to lead a law-abiding and self-supporting life upon release. Now, these are crucial to reduce recidivism and to improve public safety, which is the ultimate objective of any sentence of imprisonment. So, it is therefore arguable that prisons should therefore strive to improve their capacity to successfully implement rehabilitation programs by engendering a positive social climate within the prison and to put in place penal architecture that aesthetically fosters hope in both not just the prisoners, but also fosters hope in us, the practitioners. Now, for example, if that is done, it has been argued that educational initiatives can be then more effectively implemented in such a penal environment so as to minimize the negative impact of incarceration and improve the prospects of reintegration, self-esteem, and morale. Now, these are some of the sort of foundational touchstones when we think about rehabilitative programs. Now, at this juncture, it is worthwhile considering another important contextual factor. Governments across the world have generally implemented greater levels of financial control and have reduced investments in prisons. This has then subsequently resulted in fewer prison resources, and this may then be, according to some quarters, one of the causal factors that have led to an increase in prison incidences of various forms, including violence, self-harm, and suicide. Hence, there exists a significant challenge with prison budgets being either reduced or, at a minimum, being more tightly controlled by government, all in the face. So we've got less money, or our money is now more tightly controlled, but all these things are happening in the face of growing numbers of offenders and prison inmates. So you can see the strain that occurs here. Now, if you look at, and the data is a little bit old, but the reason is because we cited an article that was very, very analytical. So looking at the 2008 sort of data, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Australia's prison population was at that time historically growing at a rate of 4 times. So it was growing, the prison population was growing at a rate of 4 times that of the general population of Australia. Now, according to SAR 1999, the then imprisonment rate of 170 per 100,000 population in Australia well exceeded the rates found across Northern as well as Western Europe, Canada, and New Zealand. Now, there is also growing support. So in addition to these pressures, fiscal control, growing prisoner numbers, and so on and so forth, there is another factor that we need to consider when we think about what we should be doing with our prisons. And that is the growing support for the policy of justice reinvestment. Now, Dr. Gary Coventry here has done a lot of research in this area, and if you get a chance, you should read his work. It's really very good. Now, the thing about it is that because there is this growing support for the policy of justice reinvestment, we need to know how will that impact on prisons, right? Now, what is justice reinvestment? There are quite a lot of different definitions, but I thought this one really suited what we're talking about today. And that is, it is a criminal justice reform that involves the redirection of money from, guess where? Prisons, all right? The redirection of money from prisons to fund and rebuild human resources and physical infrastructure in areas most affected by levels of incarceration and contact with the criminal justice system. Now, this policy platform is premised on the notion that resources should be allocated to strategies that better address the causes of offending, as compared to the use of prisons. But not the use of prisons more generally. It's actually quite how should I put this, narrow. It's the use of prisons, so the comparison here is the use of prisons as a tool of deterrence. Because time and time again, we have seen studies showing that prisons don't work very well as a tool of deterrence. So if you're looking at it from that point of view, then justice reinvestment is wonderful, because it addresses the weaknesses of the prison from that perspective, and hence you are going to be throwing good money after bad. Now, juxtaposed against these financial pressures also exists a growing body of opinions that expects prisons to be more punitive, based on the classical school of thought that tougher prisons will act as a tougher deterrent against crime. So you can see, you've got so many things happening all at the same time, pulling the prison in various directions. What does the prison do in those sort of circumstances? Now, obviously, these are really trying times for correctional institutions. But this is also precisely why there is a greater need for prisons to think about implementing meso level. So meso level here basically refers to the local institutional level, right? Local institutional level changes to the social climate and the architectural design so as to maximize its correctional resource capacity to rehabilitate offenders and to improve upon inmate treatment responsivity, as well as to introduce changes to a suite of therapeutic tools that will be better able to address the local offenders' needs. So let's move away. Let's think about looking at the prisons not so much as a tool of deterrence anymore, but rather look at it as a way of rehabilitating more effectively the offender. Whether this can be done or not, it remains to be seen. As I said, if you look at the way the Norwegians have done it, it looks pretty good, 16 to 20% recidivism rates. But the thing is, I cannot tell you whether we're comparing apples with apples in terms of the seriousness of the offenders, the seriousness of the crime, and so on and so forth. But certainly it warrants greater study. Now, it is arguable that if you look at it from that point of view, the improvement of the architectural design, if you look at it from the point of view of improving the social climate within the prisons, if you look at it in terms of privileging the rehabilitative aim over the deterrence aim, then we would humbly suggest that these recommendations would actually fit quite nicely under the Queensland Corrective Services vision of being a world-class, high-performing, top-tier public safety agency. Okay, we would humbly suggest. To that end, December 2017 saw the commencement of a Townsville Correctional Complex internal management review of what programs and services were being delivered so as to ensure that the prison suite of interventions would go beyond mere deterrence, would go beyond simply using prisons as a tool that either specifically deters the offender when they come in or as a tool of fear by generally deterring people outside from committing crime. Now, this exercise also coincided with the recruitment of a new manager for offender development. Now, the internal management review was not a particularly easy task, given that the Townsville Correctional Complex is the most diverse prison in Queensland, operating eight geographically separate but operationally interlinked sites. This is, in part, consistent with the lay of the land in Queensland, as this state has a geographically dispersed and diverse population. Now, this presents, obviously, quite unique challenges to our correctional system, particularly when the objective of effectively rehabilitating the offenders or the inmates may be adversely impacted upon matters such as being unable to provide them through care post-release, because they will be going back to quite remote homes out of the reach of the officers based in, for example, in Townsville. Now, another significant issue is the overrepresentation of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander peoples in prisons. If you look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics data circa 2017-2018, Queensland actually accounts for 23% of the total Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prison population in the country. Just in our state, 23%. So, added to that complexity, you then have the fact that the Townsville Correctional Complex operates both women's and men's prisons, with both of them having both high and low security sites. Now, when we think about the gender difference, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the national average daily number of females and males in custody both increased since the June quarter of 2017, with females actually increasing at a higher percentage than males. So it was 8% as compared to males that would be 4%. Now, the actual numbers are small, 268 persons in terms of females and 1,382 persons in terms of males. But just looking at it from a percentage point of view, it does seem something that we should be looking into. Consequently, Townsville holds a very diverse, often overcrowded, and unfortunately overrepresented in terms of its Indigenous populations in an ever-changing prison environment that is, for better or worse, constantly under the scrutiny of the media and members of the public. So, let's be honest here. There is no easy solution, right? There is no easy solution to this. No easy, no quick solution. Nevertheless, even though there are certainly operational issues, operational challenges, according to Mr. Peter Hall, these are not insurmountable, right? They're not insurmountable. And in fact, may offer quite exciting opportunities to leverage upon the advantages as well as to share the lessons learned from site to site. Leaving aside for the time being the prison architectural reforms, the Townsville Correctional Complex has actually adopted an approach that is, in a sense, primed in terms of its diversity and inclusivity in regards to program development as well as access for prisoner groups. Now, they actively take into account the local characteristics of the prison cohorts, and through that data has attempted to construct a suite of activities and programs that essentially go beyond mere deterrence, as the outcomes are positive and empowering in their objectives. Now, these activities provide not just skills and knowledge, but also aim to improve personal insight, improve their ability to cope and adapt and thrive once released from the prison and into the community. Now, many of these initiatives are actually, in a sense, also methods that improve the quality or improve the social climate of those prisons. So, in a sense, when we talk about rehabilitative programs in this context, they actually kill two birds with one stone. Now, perhaps more importantly, what we have seen here is that a range of these programs, now they have been developed through local and regional partnerships with key stakeholders, and therefore and thereafter delivered either in tandem with each other or delivered jointly with each other. Now, by leveraging on community-wide resources like these, the problems and limitations identified earlier, remember we talked about the budgets and things like that, those problems earlier faced are to a certain extent addressed and ameliorated, and we would humbly suggest is a hallmark of the way the Townsville Correctional Complex operates in these really difficult circumstances. Now, there are a range of programs that are quite noteworthy. In particular, the Indigenous Leadership Program, developed and delivered by the Bindle Sharks organization. Then you've got the Shine for Kids Belonging to Family program. And finally, you've got the Red Cross Prison program. Now, taking each in turn, the Bindle Sharks believe that the participation in sports, recreation, cultural activities, and lunch, and education and training are inextricably linked to reducing Indigenous disadvantage within the communities. Now, basically what has happened here is this. This Indigenous Leadership Program has allowed prison inmates to actually access the same opportunities and resources that will ultimately improve their life chances. And because of that, the likelihood of them going on to be successfully reintegrated in the community goes up that much higher. Interestingly, it's also important for us to take into account that what is particularly edifying about this program is that it is also available to non-Indigenous offenders or inmates. And they have actually taken advantage of this program to great success, or some success as well. So we are seeing, in a sense, these cultural barriers broken in terms of really understanding that sometimes, depending on the type of programs that we've created, they can have quite extensive applicability, even across different cultures. But we still need to test it, right? We still need to test that. Now, this is the very essence of why the aims go beyond mere deterrence, regardless of ethnicity and even gender. Now, the Belonging to Family program, now this is currently only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents who have 6 to 12 months to go in terms of time to serve. Now here, group work is actually used to assist in helping them maintain and strengthen their family ties while they are still in prison, with their immediate family, their extended family, as well as their community leaders and elders. Now, the reason for such an initiative is because by doing that, there is the anticipation that when these inmates are released, the transition in terms of being close to their families once again will be shorter, and therefore with that support of the family, hopefully that will then ensure that recidivism is kept to a minimum, because you've got that family support to scaffold them during that critical phase post-release. Now, the third one, the award-winning Irish Red Cross Prison Program, is actually a unique approach to raising community health, hygiene, awareness, and first aid programs within the prisons. And they actually use peer-to-peer educators. Now, the program operates under the auspices of the Irish Red Cross and the Irish Prison Service and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly enough, this program is only being conducted in Australia, here in Townsville, which I think is a really wonderful feather in our cap that we were actually selected to do this. Now, this initiative benefits not just the prisoner cohort, but also the correctional staff cohort, because they are also involved in these awareness health programs and things like that. Okay, so where do we go from here? Now, I think if you look at this issue very carefully, you will notice that, at least looking at the Norwegian model, there are certain things that have to be done. Firstly, the architectural design has to be put in place in a way that creates hope, not just for the offenders, but also for the staff. They are equally impacted by the surroundings. So the more austere the surroundings, the more harsh the surroundings, you can be sure our own officers will be pretty glum about it as well. And that will then impact upon their own ability to deliver top quality rehabilitative programs. With regards to the improving of the social climate, now, there have been some examples of this being done, and one of them is quite interesting. There was a study that showed that if you paint the walls of a school or of a clinic or hospital in light pastel colors, then chances are the people working there, as well as the patients, they will feel very much more relaxed and more amenable to following instructions and so on and so forth. So what they did was they painted the walls of a jail pink, baby pink, to see if that would work. And strangely enough, it did. So the physical surroundings can actually be manipulated in such a way that it will then impact on our own emotions, our own attitudes, and so on and so forth. Another type of program, and remember I said earlier that some of these programs, rehabilitative programs, can serve two purposes. One, to rehabilitate, but another one, to actually improve the social climate. Have you heard of this program where they bring in or they introduce little cute animals, puppies and things like that, to inmates? This is so that they will they'll learn how to take care of the animal, and they will develop feelings of empathy and things like that. Now, there is definitely some relationship between that and later on a reduction of violent tendencies and aggression and things like that. There is. But more generally, it has been actually argued that programs like that also create a sense of well-being within the environment, and that impacts, therefore, on the particular social climate of the institution. The only problem is this: can we do it? And I don't know. And I don't know because if you look at the structure of punishment, if you look at the structure of the way we sentence our offenders, you will notice that we have 5 different aims. And rehabilitation is quite contrary to retribution. It's quite contrary to incapacitation. That means we just throw them into a prison and warehouse them there so that the community outside of the prison will be kept safe from this particular person inside. Now, these are almost polar opposite types of objectives that the prison is supposed to achieve. Now, that inherent conflict can be quite, how should I put this? It can be quite debilitating, especially when you look at it from the point of view of the correctional officers inside, trying their best to rehabilitate and so on and so forth. So you've got that strain. We really have to try and resolve it. We have to, sometimes when you look at the way judges decide on the punishments, sometimes they fail to actually articulate what specific objective should be privileged over all the others. They'll normally say that it is denunciation because you did something terrible, so we need to put you in prison so that this is the way we express as a society our disgust at what you've done. So we'll throw you into prison because that's the most severe form of punishment that we have. But at the same time, they'll say that, okay, but then you're quite amenable, you're quite young, so we'll actually put you in a low security incarcerative institution so that you can be rehabilitated. But you've got those two opposing sort of objectives. So the people who are standing at the breach are our correctional officers. What are they going to do? You see? So I think that's something that we really need to think about very deeply and decide as a community. Should we draw more clearer parameters in terms of what should be done? Another problem that I can see in regard to this matter is the issue of penal populism. Even if our correctional officers want to put in place better rehabilitative programs, but if the community through various platforms, whether the new media or the old media, if they keep clamoring for harsher, more punitive punishments, and that then gets picked up by our politicians who, during a 3 or 4 year cycle, election cycle, then start to articulate similar types of positions, then what do we do as practitioners? Do we then say, okay, we will go with the political wind and do what our political masters want us to do? Or do we stay firm to certain ideals that we firmly believe will actually result in the betterment of the community? Now, that is a question that is so difficult to answer from a practitioner's point of view. When your boss tells you to do something, invariably you try and do it, and you do it to the best of your ability. But that may be in conflict with certain other things you know to be true because of the empirical evidence. Deterrence, by and large, when prisons are used as an instrument of that aim, it doesn't work. So what do you do? So, I will leave you with that question, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.